In the scorching sands of the eastern desert, Rome's wealthiest man, Marcus Crassus, marched toward immortality. He sought glory, not gold. But the gods gave him neither. Betrayed by arrogance, outmaneuvered by nomads, and silenced by the very metal he worshipped, his death became legend. Not for how he lived, but for what was poured down his throat. Marcus Licinius Crassus was the richest man Rome had ever known. While Julius Caesar expanded the Republic through brutal conquest in Gaul, and Pompey the Great secured glory by dominating the seas and stamping out piracy, Crassus built his empire not on blood-soaked battlefields, but on ash, land deals, and slavery. He was the man who bought burning houses, enslaved defeated rebels, and turned misfortune into fortune. When Rome burned, Crassus profited. When Spartacus and his followers were crushed, he lined the Appian Way with crucified slaves and claimed their land as spoils. His power was undeniable, his fortune unthinkable. But respect? That still eluded him. In the eyes of his peers, Crassus was not a warrior, but a financier. Not a hero of Rome, but a banker who played politics. And that wounded him more than any blade could. At 60 years old, when most men of his class would retreat to vineyards and marble villas, Crassus became restless. Watching Caesar hailed as a living god and Pompey celebrated in endless parades, he felt himself slipping into historical irrelevance. It wasn't enough to be rich, not anymore. Crassus wanted the one thing Rome didn't believe he had earned glory: eternal, carved in stone, battlefield-won glory. And to gain it, he looked east. The Parthian Empire, stretching beyond the Euphrates into the heart of Mesopotamia, represented everything Crassus lusted for: prestige, military greatness, and unimaginable wealth. Silk, spice, gold, he convinced himself it could all be his. He imagined statues of himself in the Forum, triumphal arches bearing his name, and poets immortalizing his conquest in verse. His mind was already writing the history before the war had begun. The Roman Senate, suspicious of his intentions, refused to authorize a formal declaration of war. No matter. Crassus pressed forward regardless. He didn't need permission. He needed legacy. In 55 BCE, he assumed command of Syria not as a governor but as an emperor in waiting. He saw himself as Caesar's equal, Pompey's rival, and soon, the conqueror of the East. He dismissed omens. He ignored seasoned commanders who warned him about the Parthian style of warfare. To him, they were just another group of ill-disciplined barbarians, waiting to collapse under the weight of Roman discipline and steel. But he was wrong. Fatally wrong. And the price of his delusion would be paid not just in gold, but in blood. What Crassus didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that he wasn't marching toward a campaign. He was marching into a trap set not by brute force, but by a master of strategy and patience. And the sands of the East would not remember his glory. They would remember his fall. In 55 BCE, Marcus Crassus arrived in Syria not to govern, but to conquer. His appointment as governor was merely a formality. He saw it as a launchpad for his own Eastern war, one that would eclipse the victories of both Caesar and Pompey. The Roman Senate had denied him official approval to declare war on Parthia. No matter. Crassus was too rich to need permission, and far too proud to wait for it. He believed that with enough legions, enough coin, and enough will, he could reshape history by force. And so he began preparing for one of Rome's largest eastern campaigns. 7 full legions, nearly 40,000 infantry supported by 4,000 cavalry, and thousands of auxiliaries, archers, engineers, and supply convoys. It was a military juggernaut, financed largely by Crassus himself. But beyond the soldiers and the siege engines, there was one figure that mattered most to him: his son, Publius Crassus, a young and decorated warrior who had earned glory under Caesar in Gaul. This would not just be a campaign, it would be a legacy. A moment to bind father and son in eternal Roman greatness. At first, everything seemed to favor Crassus. The frontier towns submitted without resistance. No major Parthian force appeared. Reports spoke of internal unrest in the Parthian court and a distracted king. Villagers fled at the sight of Roman banners. Roads were clear. Spirits were high. Crassus saw it all as a sign, destiny unfolding. But the silence was a trap. Lurking just beyond the dust and horizon was General Surena, the 7-year-old Parthian commander. Charismatic, brilliant, and fluent in deception, Surena had no intention of meeting the Romans head-on. He knew exactly who he was fighting. Not just Rome, but Crassus, the arrogant old banker in search of battlefield fame. Instead of defending, Surena vanished into the desert and began to draw the Romans in, deeper into the heat, farther from their water sources, away from familiar terrain. His cavalry scouts harassed Roman supply lines, attacked from afar, and disappeared before they could be caught. At night, Roman sentries reported strange sounds, distant hooves, faint war cries, voices that vanished in the wind. Sleep became rare. Tension grew. Crassus, still blind with ambition, ignored the unease spreading among his officers. To him, this was simply how barbarians fought, cowardly, evasive, undisciplined. He believed that once the decisive clash came, Roman steel would prevail. He was still imagining his triumphal march into Babylon. But each day, his legions were more fatigued. Each mile of sand stole their strength. The longer they marched without a real enemy to face, the more the fear began to whisper. Maybe they were not the hunters, but the hunted. Crassus had set out to prove that money and ambition could forge an empire. But he had entered a war he did not understand, in a land that would not obey him. And behind every grain of sand, the Parthians waited silent, invisible, and ready. At first, the desert felt empty, too empty. As the Roman legions pushed deeper into Mesopotamia, the lack of resistance only seemed to reinforce Crassus's confidence. There were no grand armies, no walled cities standing in defiance, only small settlements that surrendered without a fight, and long stretches of dry, open terrain. The Parthians, he assumed, were already retreating in fear. But Crassus had misread the silence. What he thought was victory was actually strategy. General Surena, the young Parthian commander, had no intention of giving Crassus the battle he craved. Instead, he watched from afar, letting the Romans come to him step by step, hour by hour, deeper into a landscape that would slowly become their prison. The Romans didn't know it yet, but they were being hunted. Surena's forces, composed almost entirely of cavalry, operated like phantoms. Horse archers would appear on the horizon just long enough to spook Roman scouts, then vanish. Small supply convoys were ambushed, their escorts slaughtered before they could raise an alarm. At night, Roman soldiers heard strange noises, distant hoofbeats, war cries that faded into wind, shadows that never stayed still. Sleep became rare. Paranoia spread like fever. The desert, which had once seemed like a highway to conquest, now felt alive, hostile, watching. Crassus's officers began to worry. They urged caution, but he dismissed their concerns as cowardice. After all, hadn't the barbarians always fled before Rome? He was convinced the Parthians were weak, disorganized nomads who would collapse the moment a real Roman formation met them in open battle. But the Parthians were not nomads, and they were far from disorganized. Surena knew exactly what he was doing. He was wearing the Romans down without ever firing a decisive shot. The heat, the fatigue, the psychological torment, these were his weapons. The Roman legions were trained for close-quarters combat, for forests and hills, for cities with walls and gates. But here, in the boundless sands, they were too slow, too heavy, too blind. And the deeper they went, the worse it became. The supply lines grew longer and thinner. Water grew scarce. The men were exhausted. They marched under a punishing sun, backs aching beneath their armor, always watching the hills, the horizon, the sky, waiting for enemies who refused to appear. But the enemy was everywhere. They were the wind, the dust, the silence. By the time Crassus realized that traditional Roman tactics were useless, it was already too late to turn back. The Parthians had no need to defeat his army in one battle. They would bleed it slowly, until all that remained was panic and bones. And Crassus, once so confident, so hungry for glory, was beginning to feel something unfamiliar: fear. He had come seeking immortality, but in the Parthian desert, he had become lost. The city was called Carrhae, a lonely outpost on the edge of the desert, surrounded by dry plains and low hills. It offered little in the way of glory, but for Crassus, it seemed like the perfect place to make his stand. Scouts reported that the Parthian army was finally approaching. After weeks of silence, evasion, and exhaustion, Crassus believed that the real battle had finally come. This, he told himself, was the moment he had waited for. The clash that would prove him Caesar's equal. The confrontation that would immortalize his name in marble. He arranged his army in traditional Roman formation: heavy infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings, light skirmishers at the front. Standards were raised, shields were polished, trumpets sounded. Crassus stood at the center, flanked by generals and his son, Publius, who commanded the right-wing cavalry. The desert sun shimmered overhead. The men braced for glory. Then came the sound. Not the roar of charging infantry, not the grinding of siege weapons, but a whistle, followed by a dark cloud rising into the sky. Arrows! Thousands of them. They rained down with terrifying speed and accuracy. Parthian horse archers galloped across the battlefield in wide arcs, unleashing volleys that seemed endless. Crassus watched in horror as his men raised their shields, only to be struck from above, from behind, from every angle. Roman armor, built for close combat, was nearly useless. The air was thick with dust and screams. Yet the Parthians didn't charge. They never got close. They stayed just out of reach, moving like smoke, their horses never still, their quivers never empty. Surena had prepared camel caravans loaded with spare arrows, ensuring his men could fire without pause for hours. The Romans were trapped in the open, slowly bleeding under a storm they couldn't stop. Publius, young and eager to prove himself, begged his father for permission to strike. He believed that if he led a cavalry charge directly at the Parthian center, he could break their momentum. Crassus hesitated but gave in. He needed something to shift the tide. Publius and his cavalry thundered forward. For a moment, it looked like bravery. For a moment, it looked like hope. Then the trap closed. The Parthian cataphracts, heavily armored shock troops, absorbed the charge like a steel wall. And from the sides, horse archers swarmed in, surrounding the Roman cavalry on all sides. There was no retreat, no reinforcement, no escape. They were massacred. And then, the nightmare deepened. A Parthian rider galloped toward the Roman lines, holding a spear aloft. Atop it was a head, Publius's head, bloodied, lifeless, eyes open in death. He paraded it in front of Crassus' position, slowly, deliberately, turning so that the father could see. In that moment, something broke in Marcus Crassus. Not just command, not just morale, something deeper, something final. The general who had once dreamed of glory stood paralyzed in horror, unable to speak, unable to lead. Around him, his army crumbled. And the Parthians hadn't even gotten close. The death of Publius was more than personal tragedy. It was the moment the Roman army broke from the inside. The sight of their general's son paraded like a trophy shattered whatever discipline had remained. Whispers turned to panic. Panic turned to disorder. The legions that had once crossed the Euphrates with pride were now frozen in fear, their confidence bleeding into the dust along with their wounded. Crassus, once so eager to lead, could barely speak. He stood like a statue, his face blank, his armor caked with sweat and sand. He issued no clear orders. His voice trembled. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the head of his son had disappeared behind a wall of horsemen. Meanwhile, the Parthians never stopped. Their arrows fell like rain. Their horses moved like waves. Every attempt by Roman infantry to counterattack failed before it began. They couldn't catch the enemy. They couldn't reach them. They were fighting ghosts with spears. As day turned to night, the situation grew desperate. Water supplies were running low. The wounded cried out. Many left where they lay. Crassus knew he couldn't survive another day like this. He decided to retreat to fall back toward the city of Carrhae, hoping that urban terrain might offer protection from the relentless cavalry. But it was too late. The retreat, meant to be strategic, quickly unraveled into chaos. Exhausted, disoriented, and terrified, Roman soldiers abandoned formation. Some threw down their shields. Others collapsed in the sand, unable to move. In the dark, they tripped over corpses and stumbled into ambushes. The Parthians harassed them through the night, never pressing too hard, just enough to keep the fear alive. By dawn, half the Roman army had vanished, cut down during the retreat, lost in the dark, or left behind. The survivors who reached Carrhae were not soldiers anymore. They were broken men, dehydrated, disarmed, defeated. Some wept, others stared blankly into space. Their faces, once filled with Roman pride, were hollow. Crassus, now visibly aged, tried to rally them. He called for rest, reorganization, but there was no rallying point left. The standards had been lost. The officers were dead or scattered. The camp had no walls, and the desert offered no mercy. In just 2 days, one of the most powerful armies Rome had ever assembled had been reduced to a ghost. Crassus had gotten his decisive battle, but it had decided nothing in his favor. His dream of glory had turned into a nightmare so complete, it didn't need swords to finish it off. The Parthians didn't even need to storm the city. They just waited. They watched. They let the Roman army decay from within. And Crassus, who had marched into Mesopotamia with gold in his eyes, now found himself surrounded by death, failure, and silence. The empire he sought to build had crumbled before it even began. Crassus was broken. His army was in ruins. His son was dead, and his legacy, once so carefully crafted, now lay buried beneath desert sand. And yet, somewhere within him, a fragile hope still flickered. Perhaps there was still a way out. Perhaps something could be salvaged. He clung to the idea that negotiation, however humiliating, might spare what remained of his men. Then came word from the Parthians. Surena, the very man who had orchestrated the Roman destruction, sent envoys under a white flag. They offered terms, a peaceful withdrawal, no further bloodshed. The message was clear. The Parthians had proven their point. Now, Crassus only needed to come and speak. To his remaining officers, it reeked of a trap. They warned him, begged him, but Crassus, drained of strength and desperate for closure, agreed to the meeting. He needed it to be real. He needed to believe that there was still honor left in the ashes. The two commanders were to meet on neutral ground, each with a small escort. The desert morning was still and strangely calm as Crassus rode out, his posture rigid, his eyes sunken, the weight of failure hanging over every movement. At first, the meeting was tense, but civil. The Parthian interpreters relayed words of peace, but something shifted. Accounts from Roman sources differ on what sparked the violence. Some say it was a mistranslation, others a deliberate insult. But one thing is certain. Within minutes, the negotiations collapsed into chaos. Parthian soldiers lunged forward. Crassus's guards were overwhelmed. Swords were drawn. Horses screamed. And the governor of Syria, once Rome's richest man, was dragged from his saddle, a prisoner in the hands of the enemy he had so arrogantly underestimated. What followed was not a swift execution. It was a statement. To the Parthians, Crassus was not simply a general. He was a symbol of Roman greed, an invader who had crossed borders unprovoked, who had marched into their lands not for defense, but for personal glory and gold. His punishment had to reflect not just military defeat, but moral judgment. The Parthians prepared a death meant to burn into memory. They melted gold, his obsession, his idol, and prepared to pour it down his throat. According to the most chilling accounts, Crassus was held down, his mouth forced open. The molten metal, glowing and furious, flowed inside him, turning his body into a furnace. It was theatrical, ceremonial, deliberate. A punishment crafted to embody the very sin he had built his life upon. Even if parts of the tale were exaggerated in Roman retellings, The symbolism was undeniable. Crassus had worshipped gold. Now it destroyed him. The man who had measured worth in coin died choking on its liquid form. And for the Parthians, it sent a clear message to all future invaders. The East would not be taken lightly. Conquest would be punished not just with death, but with memory. Crassus had marched toward immortality. He had found it in the worst way imaginable. News of Crassus's death traveled west like a sandstorm blown from the desert, fast, choking, impossible to ignore. Within weeks, the Roman elite learned of the disaster at Carrhae. Not just the defeat, not just the retreat, but the humiliation, the execution, the golden death. It struck the Senate like a thunderclap, ripping through layers of arrogance and illusion. Rome had believed itself invincible, eternal, destined to expand. But in the East, that illusion had melted along with Crassus's body. The political fallout was immediate. The fragile balance that had held the Republic together began to shatter. For years, the triumvirate Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus had ruled Rome not as a unified body, but as a tense alliance of ambition. Crassus had been the stabilizer, the banker, the broker of influence and wealth. He didn't command armies like the others, but he had resources they needed. And while the three had often clashed, his presence forced Caesar and Pompey to restrain themselves. Now he was gone. With Crassus dead, the partnership collapsed. No one remained to mediate the growing rivalry between Caesar and Pompey. Old alliances frayed, trust dissolved. Rome began to fracture not from outside invasion, but from within. Pompey, once Caesar's closest ally, now saw him as a threat. Caesar, still in Gaul, was accumulating both victories and loyalty. The Senate, nervous and fractured, leaned toward Pompey, fearing Caesar's rising power. What began as political tension quickly turned into maneuvering, accusations, legal threats, ultimatums, and then civil war. The republic that Crassus had hoped to glorify with his Eastern campaign began to unravel because of it. His failure didn't just cost Rome an army. It opened a void, and that void consumed the state. Meanwhile, the Parthians made full use of their symbolic victory. Crassus's severed head, according to several accounts, was sent to King Orodes II and reportedly used as a prop in theatrical plays. During a performance of the Bacchae, one of Euripides' darkest tragedies, Crassus's skull was presented on stage as the head of Pentheus, the arrogant king torn apart for his hubris. The message could not have been clearer. Rome's pride had been punished. The surviving Roman soldiers, those who hadn't been killed or enslaved, were scattered across the Parthian Empire. Many were settled in distant frontier towns. Some eventually intermarried and disappeared into local populations. For Parthia, it was a show of mercy. For Rome, it was a lasting humiliation. And yet, amidst the ashes of Crassus's defeat, something larger emerged. His death, so grotesque, so symbolic, became more than just a historical footnote. It became a turning point. A reminder that empire is fragile, that arrogance breeds ruin, that even the richest man in the most powerful nation can die, choking on the thing he loved most. Crassus had set out to elevate himself to the ranks of Caesar and Pompey. Instead, he paved the road to their destruction. His quest for immortality destroyed not only himself but the fragile order holding Rome together. The Republic would never recover. Marcus Crassus had wanted his name etched into Roman history. He got his wish, but not as a conqueror, not as a statesman, not as the third pillar of Rome's greatness. No, he was remembered as the man who died with molten gold poured down his throat, a symbol of greed so grotesque it transcended time. For centuries after his death, poets, playwrights, and philosophers returned to that image. The golden execution, the banker turned general who thought wealth could buy destiny. His end became a cautionary tale across empires, told not for entertainment, but for instruction. Plutarch, writing more than 100 years later, described Crassus not as a military figure, but as a moral failure. He saw in Crassus a man consumed by hunger for more land, More coin, more admiration. And in his downfall, a lesson that ambition unchained from wisdom becomes a curse. Even modern historians debate whether the story of the molten gold is literal or symbolic. Did it truly happen? Or did Roman writers, in their grief and need for meaning, invent the perfect punishment for the perfect sin? Either way, the truth lies not in the act, but in what it represents. Because what really killed Crassus wasn't Parthian steel. It wasn't the desert heat or even Surena's strategy. What killed him was the same thing that had made him powerful: his insatiable desire for more. He had everything a man could ask for: wealth beyond imagination, influence in the Senate, a name feared across Rome, but it wasn't enough. Not for him. He needed the one thing he had never earned: military glory. And so, he traded wisdom for ego, lives for reputation, and eventually, breath for molten gold. His death marked more than the end of one man. It marked the death of illusion, the illusion that Rome's expansion was unstoppable, that gold could buy greatness, that history would bend to the will of one man's ambition. In the ashes of Carrhae, thousands of Roman bones lay buried beneath the sands, nameless men who paid the price for their general's pride. And above them, in story and memory, one name endured: Crassus. A man who mistook wealth for strength. A man who sought eternity through conquest. And who found it not in glory, but in infamy. Today, his story still whispers through history books, lecture halls, and the ruins of fallen empires. Not as a tale of victory, but as a warning that power without restraint leads to ruin, that the brightest coin can burn the deepest scar, and that sometimes the thing we chase the hardest is the thing that destroys us. The golden throat of Marcus Crassus didn't just silence a man. It spoke for generations.